Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. We're back once again with another Mortiel Fallacy, just because I'm trying to kind of keep that on a roll here, and I'm also trying to, get things working properly. Apparently, I don't know how to operate Twitch chat. That's okay. That's not important, right? Knowing technology is not in any way required for doing streaming. Anyway, so as I promised last week, I did say that we were going to talk tonight a bit more about project management. And I initially had planned to possibly do a game stream tonight, but I actually didn't because I was a little bit delayed and didn't have time to prep and figure out even what game I wanted to play. So there was a thing. In any case, so instead, I already had that planned and already knew some sites and sources that I was going to discuss, as many who saw the website pop up there kind of surmised. Essentially, what we're going to be talking about is how, and this is part of what people don't see whenever they're talking about a video game or looking at a video game, and they make a lot of judgments about how things are done with a game, how budgets are handled, how much is required to make a game, things like that. You see a lot of times that people will talk about what things that are going on with a game in production, but they don't always understand really what goes into making a game from the actual architecture standpoint, from the actual design standpoint, and from the actual project management standpoint, which is what we're going to be focusing on tonight. We're going to be talking a lot about project management, which is kind of the key of all of this here, is project management. And I'm going to cite kind of games that that kind of mishandle this and how this would be handled properly. There's going to be one big key on there of a game that doesn't handle project management properly, and we're going to be getting into that very quickly here. So to kind of start this off, we're going to kind of define project management. Essentially, what project management is at its core is a framework of how you do organized work on any big project. For example, you could apply this very liberally and loosely to, say, building a house, for example, although project management is actually specifically assigned to other things. In this particular instance, say it was building a house that you're applying project management to, you could say, step one, find a place to build your house, right? That's step one. You need land to build a house, so you get land. Step two, you have an architect design the house, right? You have to have land, first of all. Then you have to have an architect design the house, plan out how many rooms, how many bathrooms, electrical, all of these components need to be planned into the architecture design. Then you work with a construction foreman and that sort of thing, and they actually start building the houses, usually in stages. They'll start off building the foundation, basement, that sort of thing, running electrical, running gas, running water, the foundational components to a house, its utilities and that sort of thing is usually in the foundation. Then you build the first floor, you work the wiring up the house as you go. Then you build the second floor if applicable, and or a crawl space, make sure there's insulation, make sure the walls are the proper thickness, that sort of thing. There's standard practices in building a house and that sort of thing. I'm not by any means an expert construction person, but I kind of, these are basic fundamentals of building a house, right? Software is no different, right? So in software, getting land is kind of like getting the stakeholder in the background funding. And that's where we're going to kind of start off on here. Let's go and pop our browser in here. So the first step on here is, requirement gathering and analysis, which is essentially getting your land to build the house on. This is finding out the terrain, finding out what actually you can build for this software and what it's actually going to entail, right? This is the key proponent of designing any piece of software, especially a game. This is where you ask questions like, for example, if you're doing a AAA game, this is the part where they would do a lot of market analysis, right? What game is going to be profitable at this current time? Is an open world game going to be profitable? Is an RTS game going to be profitable? Is an MMO going to be profitable? And so on, right? These are all kind of keys of actual software design, right? In an indie studio, this is where you kind of do the analysis of kind of figuring out how much it's going to cost, how you're going to secure funding. Although those are also in the AAA part, these are a little bit more important to an indie studio because they don't have the publisher funding guaranteed backing them, right? So essentially with your indie studio, they might look at some more minuscule parts of that and kind of trying to figure out how to take their creative process and put it into practice, right? So they've gotten the land. And that's the first step on there, figuring out the scope of your project, right? That's step one, scope. Figuring out what your project entails, how big is it, what's the terrain around it, what are people that are going to be vested in this, how are you securing your funding, that sort of thing is all in the kind of scope and planning process of it. This is pretty much in the software world. This essentially is a bunch of meetings with people who are usually not software developers. You'll have usually, this is where you assign a project manager, which is the person who's going to kind of be looking at things from a high level. At this point, you also might have a software architect, which is essentially a company or an industry expert who kind of sees the terrain from a high level and knows what the needs are of the company in question or of the industry in question, and they will advise on the correct path that they want to try to take software. So then they'll assign a project manager that is specifically for that project, right, as I said, and then they'll have probably like software development leads or say technology subject matter experts or SMEs that will be in there. Like for example, if you're working with Frostbite engine, they might have a Frostbite subject matter expert that can help advise on, hey, this might be in or not in the scope of this development project, right? So that kind of SME is usually a tech expert of some kind that is kind of integral to the early formations of the project to help get the bearings in the surrounding areas. This guy's usually, but not always, the same person as the actual architect. It largely depends on if you need a more specialized subject matter expert or if you can have a more generalized one. Usually you want someone more specialized so that way the architect's looking at the high level and whereas the subject matter expert's kind of getting down into the nitty gritty and the technicals of it, right? So once you have those meetings done where you kind of figure out your scope, you assign a project manager, you secure funding, right? Those are all in kind of the first step of software development. That's requirement gathering and analysis, right? The important thing on here is if you are, say, a crowd-funded indie game, what would be entailed in here is what do you want to create, right? Say, for example, is a Divinity Original Sin, right? What do you want to create? Well, we want to create a sequel to a Divinity Original Sin. Okay. Is the scope going to be the same as Divinity Original Sin or bigger? Well, usually with a lot of your sequels usually have a bigger scope. Okay, so we're going to make the scope bigger. So we're going to have more conversational options. We're going to have more character types. We're going to have more spells. We're going to have all these different things. So we're going to have more maps. Okay, so now our level designer is going to have to work more for this project. Okay, so budgets for the level design is usually X amount of money. We're going to need to increase that by 30%. Okay, we need more characters. Well, our animation, our character design, our voice actors are going to have to work X amount more. So now we need to budget X amount more for these aspects of the game. Then we're going to talk about, like, say, the storyline. How much more in-depth is the storyline going to be? Is it going to be, an even longer, more intensive storyline with more choice? Well, now we're going to have to hire more writers maybe and expand the writing budget even more for this game. All those things will affect where you actually try to secure funding. Now, then, once you figure out that scope, okay, now we have a project manager who understands that scope. It's his job to make sure that the project stays within that scope, right? So then, from there, they then look at, okay, we got to secure funding, all right? So now we're securing funding in Divinity Original Sin 2. Kickstarter is. Okay, so we've got a good estimate on the basic game. Will take X amount of money in order to complete. And maybe we have these additional things that we kind of want in the game, but might be extraneous, and we can chop them out if necessary. Those things will be on stretch goals, right? So then they secure that funding through their Kickstarter campaign, and they meet all the stretch goals. I'm pretty certain Divinity Original Sin met well in excess of their goals. Like, it was easy for them to secure it because they have a past history of meeting the expectations. So after that, we then look at the next stage of it. Now that we've secured our funding, we have our scope, we have our project manager, all the things are kind of in line, we have our land, we have our foundation, or we have our land to start things off. Excuse me. The next stage on there is design, right? And this is where we bring in the architect in the metaphor of building our house. We bring in the architect to write down, like, to draw out the house. How many floors is it going to have? Where are the floors going to be located? Where are the electrical inputs? Where is the utility lines going to come in? All of these things, this is the real meat and potatoes of getting your game correct, right? And so here's one of the things that I see done both right and wrong in this design process. So the first mistake, that first step on there, right, was determine your scope, right? That was one of the first steps in requirement gathering, is to determine your scope, right? One of the mistakes I made see on here is in the design process, people tend to get really passionate, because this is where you start bringing in a lot of the creative directors and the designers in there. And oftentimes they will say, hey, this sounds awesome. Let me go ahead and start thinking of great things I want to do in this game, right? And then it starts getting out of scope. I want to have this cool feature and that cool feature. Wouldn't it be awesome if we had a dragon that could fly around the battlefield? Well, when we had the scope for extra characters, we didn't actually scope in any kind of additional animations. They're all the same animations. They're just more variety in appearance. So we're out of the scope to have a flying creature at that point, and we've already secured funding, so we can't go outside of that because we don't have the funding for it. That's kind of the key on here of maintaining scope, is that it's all about the money at that point. If you start going out of scope, then money starts getting wasted. And this is where design is key, is the project manager should really keep things in line there. The problem is that I notice a lot of times, unfortunately, is that you have a lot of projects that start going out of control at this point. And there's one in key particular that in the design process, I think they kind of didn't have very clearly defined design before they started on to the next phase. And that would be Star Citizen. And we're actually going to look through that in depth in a moment here. I actually have their development history pulled up, and we're going to kind of actually delve into that deep in and actually kind of see, well, this is now going outside of scope. This is now going outside of scope. And you're going to kind of see how this project ballooned out because of improper management. So then once you have that design down, you have the nuts and bolts of how the game is going to, what the game is going to look like, how the development is going to progress, and what your end goal is going to be. This is usually the stage of when you start implementing timelines, right? That this is the point where you're saying, okay, 3 months we want to have this segment of the game done. 2 months we want to have this segment done. This team's going to handle this segment. This team's going to handle this segment. This is where you really start dividing up the work. You start scheduling out work progress. And this is where, a lot of methodologies come into play of how you do, like, say, sprints and that sort of thing, right, is in the design phase. Now, the implementation or coding, this is essentially where the real meat and potatoes happens. This is where the actual coding, the actual design work of characters, that sort of thing happens. And then this is kind of the key point of where I was saying the project manager has to keep things in scope. A lot of times in implementation or in the design or in this kind of creation stage right now, a lot of your developers will they'll come up with really creative ideas, and you have to as a project manager for this, or in some cases that might be the creative director, has to kind of balance trying to kind of encourage that creative input from your developers, but at the same time keeping things in scope. And that's a tough call, and sometimes you have to be the bad guy as the person that's running the project to kind of keep things in scope and not get too ahead of yourselves. And essentially, that's, like I said, the nameology of the actual person in charge might be the creative director, might be a project manager, etc. That's not important. The important point is that he's got to keep it in scope. He or she has to keep it in scope by determining what's a healthy amount of creative input and what is going outside of scope. Now, as this progresses, this usually gets assigned to various teams, right? And those teams will then, and he'll oversee and take in progress reports from teams as they progress through the stages of their development. So Team A, for example, let's say it's the character design department. Like the first week, they're designing this race of characters, and they'll come up with drafts and models and meshes of, this lizard race, for example. Okay, and then they've got the second week, they're all working on the human ones and all of those, and they'll stage it out in these short sprints typically, where they're kind of designing one piece at a time, just taking it small chunks at a time, and then he gets the progress reports from the team lead of character design, right? Or whatever the actual position name might be. And then from there, as he's overseeing that, he also has Team B, who's level design. And he's saying, okay, in this area of Rivellon, we need this map done. And that will be your 2-week project there, is creating this map and these features and that sort of thing. And they'll be doing their job and reporting back their progress to the project manager. And then he'll kind of oversee them. And it's unfortunately kind of falls on him at times to kind of be the guy that kind of kicks people in the butt a few times whenever they start falling behind on stuff. Yeah, you have to be the bad guy when you're in charge sometimes. And there's also times whenever you have to be a bit more lenient whenever you realize that, hey, there's a reason for this. One of the problems that gets implemented in this phase that is a huge problem in the gaming industry, and I see this a lot, is during this phase, they will sometimes decide to switch game engines or switch some critical underpinning foundation of the game. And then essentially you've scrapped a shit ton of work. For example, I believe, we're going to get into detail with Star Citizen whenever we go into that. Star Citizen actually scrapped its game engine in mid-flight essentially, and had to kind of start all over. But as far as I understand, there was something like this for Mass Effect Andromeda that was done, not for the game engine. They started off making the game in Frostbite. That's the one. They were making it in Frostbite. But they were using a certain facial animation engine or some such, I believe, and then in mid development, or late development actually, they actually switched the facial animation engine or algorithm or what have you, I believe is what it was. I may be wrong on that one, that I don't have all the story on that. The point is that is also a huge mistake in any project management. that usually cost a lot of money and waste a lot of money, and it usually causes issues with timeline lapses. And from there, because right now, like for example, if you're 2/3 of the way through your development and somebody says, oh, we want to switch the facial animation generator, now you have to start all over again on your facial animation. Start from scratch. That's brutal. If you're an engineer, you want to shoot yourself. Like that, especially with Andromeda, as far as I understand, they made that critical change 3 years into the development of the game, if I'm remembering correctly. That means that you now have to get done what took you previously 3 years, up to 3 years, you now have to turn around and get done in like a year. And that's not easy. It's not like they're coming up with new creative designs. It's usually that they have to do the actual man hours. They have to do the actual facial animation carving or whatever manually all over again. And that's 3 years worth of work that they have to do in a year. And that's usually where you get the infamous AAA crunch time, where you're working, 20-hour days and you're sleeping in the office. You don't see anybody for a week. That's where those scenarios come in, and that's disgusting practice, and that's a sign of bad project management. The next stage on this, though, is testing. And this is one of the most controversial, often criticized segments of project management. Okay, and this is essentially where the major development has been done on the game, and now you have to go through and you have to find out what's not working, right? And this is usually where they have actual in-house playtesters, not actual gamers. This is not beta stage yet. Usually the first phase of testing is in-house actual QA testers kind of running through basic game functions first of all to see if, like, for example, the AI is pathing characters correctly. The second step might be for them to make sure that the maps aren't clipping, that art assets are loading in properly, that and they don't always go through the entire game at this stage because that might take too long. What they'll usually do is have maybe a team, say they have 6 QA testers, right? And those QA testers will each be assigned a different area to look at. And their hope is that with 6 different testers, all looking at different angles and looking at different areas, they will cover the entire game, or at least enough of it to where they have everything. What they'll then do is they will compile a list of issues that they have encountered, detailed log. They'll have like one screen has the game loaded up with them playing the game. Screen beside them shows the debugging, which debugging more or less is live code feed as they're doing stuff in the game. The code that is running in the background of the game will be running in a verbose format while they're doing stuff in the game. If they run into an issue, they'll go and they'll mark the code that registered an error while they're doing something. Say a texture doesn't load in, they will actually mark the code that instructed that texture to load in so that they can then debug it later. In that debugging process I'm going to get into in a moment, that's the next step is so they compile that list of errors that they've occurred, right? The next is that those QA testers or a QA lead will have a meeting with, say, the creative director, aka project manager, and then other key people in the project other key people in the project to prioritize those bugs. What's the severity? Is it something that can be quickly fixed? Is it something that is an in-depth fix? How noticeable and impactful to the game is it? Those sort of things. So they kind of have the 4 quadrant prioritization where they have urgent and important issues and a combination thereof. So is it urgent? Is it important? Then it goes in the high priority box, right? Is it important but not urgent? Well, then it goes in a moderately high priority. Is it urgent but not important? It's medium low. Is it not important, not urgent? We'll get to it if we have time, maybe. And that's kind of how they tend to work out the bugs, right? Is they queue them in that process. Now, what will then happen is it will go back and the QA testers might work with the teams that were developing, or the teams might work in isolation from the QA department to fix the listed bugs. This is usually where good communication helps between the two, of clearly marking the code that is registering the error, and making sure that you go back then and test it again and again and make sure that it's smoothed out. And this is kind of the painstaking process of the whole thing. Debugging, any engineer I know hates the debugging process because it's painstaking. You have to go sometimes the segment of code that is registering an error and is returning an actual error code may be a huge segment of code, and you have to go maybe sometimes line by line. Well, not usually line by line, but you have to find separate commands and separate calls to different functions that might potentially return that error, especially if when you design the game, or if the game engine doesn't have a very good reporting system in it. So coding, usually whenever you turn on a verbose mode and function calls happen in the game, it returns, even if it runs successfully, it will return a success code. And if it returns an error code, it usually points to a specific function call that is done that kind of gives you the actual real substantial, hey, it's specifically line 247, it was this function call on line 247 that was the error, and I can just zoom right up to through the source code of the game, find line 247, figure out what that was. Oh, it's pointing to the wrong asset file? Bam, switch the asset file that it's pointing to, problem fixed. That's really what QA is all about, and what testing and debugging is all about. It is painstaking work, and it is where a lot of the hair pulling out comes in any development and engineering. I'm not gonna lie, a lot of engineers I know have gone bald pulling out their hair trying to figure out why something isn't working. They'll say the code is exactly right, it is like a picture perfect function call of this command, and for some reason it still won't work, and you go gray just trying to figure out why this thing that's written perfectly for some reason doesn't work. It's really, really painful. But in that process, testing then will usually have additional stages. A lot of the QA managers I know would be angry at me and shaking my fist if I just glossed over testing, because that's the first stage, right? The in-house QA then roll back to the developers to correct those. Then they might go out to a beta stage deployment, which either might have more in-house testing. Like that first stage is usually the alpha build, right? That's what you might see. Now, alpha, unfortunately, has kind of gotten painted in a really weird light of late. So that's why I try not to use those terms, because they confuse people. But traditionally, that first stage to QA testers in-house was called the alpha stage. That's where shit's really a buggy mess. And that's where you get a lot of issues corrected. That's where they knock out a lot of them. The beta stage is usually either it's back to those same QA testers if they're doing it more in-house, or more commonly, this is where you see it get deployed out to more massive audiences in some fashion or another. They usually like to try to get betas out to as many hands as possible, because this is where you test more macro functions of the game. For example, in an MMO or other online persistent game, this is where you test out your server load balancing and that sort of thing to make sure that your servers aren't going to fail over every time you have more than 100 people load into them. That would be devastating to your audience, especially if you're planning to have hundreds of thousands of people running in there at the same time. So that's where a lot of those tests occur on a macro level. They may be aware of a lot of the little bugs. So when you're doing a beta test for, say, something like Star Wars Battlefront, or whatever other big AAA title that releases a public beta, first of all, the public beta is primarily there as a publicity stunt. They want to try to get the the game in the hands of people early to try to drum up some publicity for the game before it's launched. That's usually what those AAA beta tests are really about. But the thing is that at the same time, they're also using that as a way to stress test their network infrastructure and the game, how well the game handles a lot of people playing the game. They don't usually, like if there are any bugs in the game, usually those bugs are already on a list somewhere, just sitting at a low priority to where they didn't get handled before the beta test. They may go back and fix those later if they have time at the end of the development. If the beta test went well, then they might go back and kind of polish off those last few things before they go gold. Going gold is whenever the software hits the next stage, which is deployment. Deployment is an oft overlooked stage of this whole situation because of the fact that deployment is kind of taken for granted, right? When you deploy software out there, this is where a lot of your additional costs come in after R&D. When you're deploying, this can be anything from getting it to mass distributors for putting it on a CD, putting it on store shelves, or it could be getting it to Steam, uploading it to Steam and managing that. This is also a lot of where marketing comes in. This is whenever the game goes gold, this is where your marketing kicks into high gear. Usually if the game is in testing, you might leak out a little bit of marketing about it and get people talking about it, especially if a beta test comes up. But right before you actually launch the game, usually the weeks up to it, after it's gone gold, before it's actually launched in people's hands, this is where you ramp up marketing, get people talking about your game, right? The thing is that a lot of times things fall flat here because either A, they've been marketing the game too long. Like for example, they started marketing the game back in the design phase. Like say they started marketing the game back up here, right? Things change a lot between here and here. You end up with either design ideas get scrapped, or you end up in the implementation and coding of ideas shifting focus and that sort of thing to better fit into the scope. In testing, maybe some feature of the game turned out to just break everything and it had to be scrapped entirely because it was just so bad and disastrous. And then what you were advertising back here ended up being a freaking getting people upset because by the time it reaches here, it's changed completely from what you originally advertised. This is why you never advertise in the design stage. You usually want to maybe have some light advertisement here to kind of start drumming up people talking about the game, and then really ramp up the advertisement from when the game goes gold. In other words, all testing or all major testing is primarily done, and they're shipping it out to distributors and that sort of thing in order to start getting the game ready to launch on shelves before the game actually hits the hands of the consumers. That's when you really want to do your marketing, right? That's one of the reasons why it's a commonly overlooked state of the development process, but it's still immensely important. Then lastly, this is the one that most people are familiar with, that people get annoyed about, the maintenance phase, which is where they fix those low tier bugs that a lot of people bitch about the game not being finished. Okay, to be fair, there are cases where games release legitimately unfinished and they get fixed in the maintenance phase, which is entirely bad practice in the software development scene. And any company that does that, like any other engineers, look at them and say, hey, you guys are a bunch of amateurs. You are a shame on software development everywhere. But there are cases where there's just minor bugs that they fix in maintenance. Maintenance is also where this is a cyclical cycle. In other words, it goes in a circle, it continues. Maintenance also includes rolling it back into potential new releases for the game, right? And so the key on this one is, for example, I use Elder Scrolls games, even though Bethesda makes my skin crawl. Bethesda is a good example of this, in the sense that how they kind of operate typically on their games is what you'll see them work out the base game, ideally following their basic template on SDLC, and then once they get to the maintenance phase, a part of the team will kind of roll into the maintenance and maintaining the game, fixing bugs, post-launch support in general. Then a larger segment will roll back around for requirement gathering and analysis of the first piece of DLC. And then that first piece of DLC will then roll through this process again, right? Same process as before, that all I just described. And then that will get to maintenance. And, for example, let's take Skyrim, that a lot of people are familiar with. Skyrim, they go through this process for the base game, release the base game. Part of the team, like let's say 30% of the team focuses on fixing all of the numerous bugs that are infamous in your Elder Scrolls games. And then 70% goes to work on, was it the Hearthfire was the first one? We'll say that it was Dawnguard was the first one. We'll say that. It may not have been, but we'll say it was Dawnguard was the first piece of DLC. Dawnguard rolled through this first part, right? And then that 30% that's doing post-launch support, they may still be doing post-launch support on that. They will either do one of two things from this point. They will either break off a small dedicated portion of that DLC team onto actually doing post-launch support for the DLC, which will be smaller than the main post-launch support team, or they will just take a chunk of the post-launch support team, break them off to support specifically Dawnguard. Could be a mix of both, but in any case, from there, the large portion of that DLC team then goes back to step one in order to start with Hearthfire. Then they roll through this process with Hearthfire. Same thing, part of them goes and supports Hearthfire, Dawnguard, and the base game in post-launch support, fixing bugs and that sort of thing. Then the majority of that team then goes back and they start working on the Dragonborn DLC, right? And then they go through this process for Dragonborn. And then now, once it's done, most of the team does not then go to post-launch support. Most of the team then continues on to the next project, right? And this is the key. They're going now to the next project that might be in the design point at this point for Fallout 4. And they'll start working on Fallout 4, where you still have that small 30% of the team is still working on post-launch support for a little bit longer, maybe another 6 months or so. And then they will also move on to the next game project. Now, here's the thing, and this actually is a nice little source on here. This breaks down, a lot of the actual process. On my YouTube channel video for this after the fact, I'm going to link this LinkedIn article on here for it, because it's actually a great breakdown of the SDLC cycle in general for those of you that may want to get into game design, or for those of you that may want to get into software engineering overall. This is a good idea of setting your expectation for how the process should work. Now, obviously, as I say, this is not strict. There's some flexibility that needs to be in there. The project manager, aka creative director, should be flexible enough to allow a little bit of creative input and kind of flex in the project, but also be strict enough to kind of keep things in scope, and that's kind of important. So that's that. Now, using this as kind of reference here, we're going to talk about Star Citizen. Okay, and Star Citizen is something that I've criticized a lot for its lack of project management. It's been handled like horribly. It's one of the worst managed projects I've ever seen. And I'll kind of explain this as I'm going down on here. So in 2012, Star Citizen launched a Kickstarter campaign, right? It was an extremely successful Kickstarter campaign. It met its goal, and I think back then it had like, the goal wasn't that high. It was something like, say it was $50,000 or $100,000 or $200,000 or something like that. It was actually a pretty reasonable Kickstarter campaign. Maybe it was as much as $1 million. I can't remember now at this point. But the point is that this was in 2012, and essentially what they did during that Kickstarter campaign is that they came up with several ship designs as rewards for the people backing the game, right? The Scout, Bounty Hunter, Pirate, Digital Colonel, Digital Freelancer, and Rear Admiral were all pledge levels of that Kickstarter campaign, right? So they focused a lot of initial concept development into their rewards of ships. So already in that initial, before they even get to the design process, they're already budgeting a lot of design resources to designing these ships that they're going to give as payouts for the pledges, which already that should raise red flags on saying, hey, aren't we committing a little bit too much to these, depending on how much effort those ships take to design. I that much I don't know per se, but that already might be a concern for a project manager. Now, once that's done, end of Kickstarter campaign in November 2012, right? That wasn't the end of their crowdfunding, and we're going to get to that. But that was the end of the Kickstarter campaign. At this point, the funding has been secured. At this point, they have the scope and the kind of everything on here. This stage 1, should be finished and done. You have gathered all of your requirements, analyzed the market, you have done all your homework, you have a project manager, you have a scope of your project done in this stage. You should now start in the design stage where you stick to the scope you set in step 1. What did they do? They released the hangar in 2013. That was all they did in 2013. They released the hangar where you could see your ship. For those that pledged into the Kickstarter, you could see your ship in the hangar. Yay! The persistent universe had not even gone out at this point. That was just the hangar module, and that was it. So far, that's all you could do. At this point, then they're like, okay, so now we're going to move on to get the organizational system and the area commander modules. And so these were original pieces, I believe, that were actually put into the base component. So those were part of the original thing the arena commander was. However, I believe it was starting here, I believe. No, I'm sorry. It was actually at the end of this one. The original commander, the Arena Commander version 1.0 was the kind of the end of things that kind of started to take a turn, because during these months, you see this thing where it says concept sale, concept sale, concept sale. You'll notice that these are not any of the ships listed up here, right? So what these were is these were additional ships added later on to the game for real money that you could buy in order to additionally crowdfund the game. The Kickstarter had ended. Funding should have been secured, but instead they start selling more ships to make more money. And then they had more ships. And you notice on here, most of the development at this point is developing ships to sale. Concept sale, concept sale, concept sale, concept sale, concept sale. You notice that most of the development goals reached here have all been concept sales. These are all ships that they're designing to sell them for more money. I believe it got up to the point where the largest package to buy in the game is in excess of like $15,000 for one person to buy into the crowdfunding. $15,000. That is ridiculous for a crowdfunding campaign. Now from there, you notice that on there is, I believe, was it, where is it at? They're looking at the Star Citizen CitizenCon 2015 in Manchester. So this was where shit really started to bug me on here, was when they did the first CitizenCon. So the first CitizenCon, if I'm remembering correctly on here, was like, hey, we're going to spend money in order to have this convention. We're going to live stream it, have a whole bunch of stuff going on there. Yay, hooray, everybody, we're having a CitizenCon on here. Hold on, let me actually see there, because I'm pretty certain people estimated the cost of it, and it was kind of egregious. So essentially what the issue is that they are now using crowdfunding. They were using crowdfunding to host a convention in order to try to drive up publicity for the game so they could sell more of these concepts. They haven't even released, this is Alpha 2.0. So remember what I said, by the way, Alpha is supposed to be the internal release to your QA team. Beta is what you release out to the wider audience, usually once you have most of it received. I understand the marketing side of it is they are marketing it as this is transparency, and they're doing this in order to show people that this is what we're doing. Here's the live development of the game. Except here's the problem, is because you're having to focus so much on the publicity of the game, your developers can't fucking focus on making the game. Excuse the language, but what you see in here is that we see a lot of working on ships and just basic alpha for the persistent universe. Arena Commander came first on here, because I don't believe they actually, oh wait, hold on, where was the actual alpha? No, I'm sorry, I'm pretty certain this is a mistype. I think this is Alpha 1.0 here. Was released in December of 2014, not Arena Commander. And then the patch for it was here. In any case, the point is that they've released Alpha 2.0. They have now gone through a full second software revision. Now, most people don't understand what these actual numbers mean when they see 2.0.0. That's very common software methodology of where, if I'm remembering correctly, because my brain is not working always the best, you have major revision, minor revision, patch. Okay, so when you see, for example, 2.1.1, the major revision is version 2, minor revision is version 1, so that's off of base 0, so that's one minor revision, and then one patch. My thing on here is that, first of all, you notice that they have these very incremental updates on the game here. I noticed that they do some minor releases, and then there's a big jump to revision 2. In alpha, you rarely want to go through a second revision entirely through its full cycle in alpha. Usually by the end of the second revision, it should be to beta. So the first revision is usually the live in-dev stuff. Revision 1.0 is at what point it normally goes to your QA team, your internal QA team for testing and debugging. That's 1.0. By the time it gets to 2.0, that means that it has gone back, your QA team has sent back enough stuff to where you have almost completely changed the majority of the game. The fact that that has now gone through an entire major revision in, was that 3 years of development? One major revision only in alpha. and you've entirely overhauled the game. Like, usually what I see in software in alpha stages is that you might see up to like 3 or 4 minor revisions, that second digit in here. They might see that several of that minor revision and a bunch of patches. But by the time they get to the next major revision, it's usually ready for beta stage. If you notice on here now, they continue on with these concept sales through here all through the time because they're selling those for real money. Just remember that. They have another convention in Los Angeles. This was the one that was really egregious, if I remember. They actually rented out some major convention center. It was a big deal, right? And more concept sales. And now there are 2, the 6th minor revision of the 2nd major revision of an alpha, not a beta yet. And they continue down through this in 2016. And if I remember right now, they don't have it on here, but they just are now getting around to releasing Alpha 3.0. 3.0 is where their alpha is at currently. And you notice on here, the majority of the content that they've released is concept sales. Like if we do a little quick search on here, concept sale. How many concept sales do we have on this page? 25 concept sales in the actual process on here. Now let's see how many times it mentions alpha. 19. So for the actual, and let me actually go all the way up and make sure that that's, whoops. All right, I can go down, I guess. Okay, so, and that's August of 2015. Even assuming that this is actually alpha, not arena commander, we'll assume that that is 20. So for 20 alpha revisions to the game, they have released 25 concept sales for ships that they're selling for real money. So essentially from a software design standpoint, what this looks like is they required gathering analysis, they secured their funding, all of that stuff. Then they went and they started designing the game. Realized they want to add more stuff into the game. So then they go back to the requirements gathering. They go back to step 1 to acquire more funding. That says, okay, you need to design more ships for more funding. Okay, then we have to go back to there and acquire more funding for more ships, more funding for more ships, more funding for more ships, more funding for more ships. And then they occasionally get into here, then come back to here, then occasionally go back to here. They have not really made a significant step into testing. They have only broached, because the game is in alpha, it has only reached tertiary stages, initial stages of testing. It has not reached beta stages or even into QA, like heavily at all. It's released just preliminary stages of testing, which is why if you look at even Alpha 3.0, shows off some really cool stuff. A couple of gimmicks, really. You can land on a planet now, which looks really cool. But it's still buggy as hell. I was watching Anchor 654 and it was great. It was great fun laughing at it. She tried to eject from her ship and just disappeared from the cockpit of the ship, appeared next to the ship, and bam, she's ejected. Don't know where her actual chair from the ship went to. It was just gone. It disappeared. Those kind of game-breaking bugs, like she couldn't fly her ship after that. She had to actually respawn. Like her ship was completely done. That kind of game-breaking bug should have been fixed before you even got to Alpha 2.0. That the eject function of this ship doesn't work. If that's when they added in the eject function. Oh wait, if you didn't have an eject function by this point, that should have been handled in this stage, not in this stage. They have it all backwards and confused. They're adding features, adding ships, adding stuff in the testing phase. If it's an alpha, it's supposed to be in testing, not design and implementation. And then gathering requirements to secure more funding. They don't understand what even an SDLC process looks like, which is why all you see is just a bunch of patches to the alpha on here. This is the reason why a lot of people think that this game is never going to be released, that it's vaporware, is because whoever's the creative director of this project has no idea how to manage a project. It's as if you got someone that knows how to play video games in order to run a game design project. Man, this would be cool if we had this. Wouldn't it be cool if we had this? But what if we had also this? That's not the person you want running the project. The person you want running the project is the person who's like, that would be cool, but maybe we should save that for later. That would be cool as well, but can we really do that and still maintain focus? It's the person who questions those cool ideas, not necessarily rejects them, just questions them to see if they really need to be in the project. I would love if Star Citizen actually, saw the light of day, because I really want a sci-fi simulator. For those of you that don't know, I would love to see a real good sci-fi simulator like what Star Citizen wants to be get out there, but I really don't think that Star Citizen is going to be that game. It's at this point, they're not really financially incentivized to release the game. They're financially incentivized, as you see through their development timeline here, to keep releasing concept sales. That's what they're incentivized, which is why that's what they're doing. They keep releasing these concept sales. That's what's making them money. That's why they're sitting at like $160 million of funding. To give you an idea on here, Star Wars: The Old Republic, it was infamous of its time for being one of the most expensive games to develop. GTA 5 was infamous for having one of the largest total budgets, but it spent a lot of that on marketing. Now, not to say that Star Wars: The Old Republic didn't spend a lot on marketing, but its development budget was one of the largest ever. The part of the reason why is because the scope of what they wanted to do was massive. They wanted to make an MMO with all of these zones, and it's not like an MMO isn't a large game to begin with. It is. MMOs inherently are going to be large games no matter what. That's just the nature of them. They have to be massive worlds, right? The thing is that one of the things that they wanted to do in the game that was incredibly massive is they wanted to have all of this voice acting, all of these intricate stories. Essentially, the base part of the game had six versions of KOTOR 3 in it, mixed with a PvP arena. Think about that. KOTOR 1 or KOTOR 2 themselves were their own projects that took at least a year, few years to make, with their own kind of budgets that were probably at least several $1 million or so. SOTOR had 6 KOTOR length games in them. Each of the base character class stories in the game were the length of one KOTOR game. Most people don't realize that. A lot of people will bitch and complain and say that they want a KOTOR 3, and I'm like, you have KOTOR 3 6 times over in SOTOR. And they could primarily be done completely solo for the most part. Now, not when the game originally released. That's its own problem. In any case, the point is that game had a massive scope even at its original design. The amount, it was infamous at its time for the amount of voice acting and writing that went into that game. They had a massive team of writers behind it. They had a massive team of voice actors. It was crazy how much work went into that game. Took 4 years, I believe, to make. 4 years and near $200 million. Might have been 5 years at the most. To be finished. They have since added more content to it after the fact. They've added several pieces of, I guess you could call it DLC or whatever, expansions, I guess also might be the right term. They've added several pieces of additional content to the game after the fact, but just the base game up to level 50, with the PvP arena and that sort of thing. That was all done in about 4 years. I think they originally started it in, is it 2000? I want to say 2007, something like that. And then in maybe it was 5 years, 2011, 2012, something like that. Point is it took about 4 to 5 years for the full base game with a legitimate like $200 million budget, huge crew, massive project. Took them, 5 years to make this massive game. While it doesn't always seem as big to a lot of people, from a design standpoint, I look at that and I think, holy crap, that alone is the reason why at the time I was like, man, BioWare's got their shit together. That was a nightmare project for any normal creative director or project manager. That's your nightmare level project, having to essentially design, if you look at it, the PvP arena plus the 6 original games on there. That is huge. The thing is that Star Citizen is working off of a $150 million budget, which proportionally to the games industry, that is nearly as large. Most games like AAA grade or high budget indie games make do with maybe upwards of 40 to 80 million dollars. Like Witcher 3, I believe, was $80 million, right? That was the cost of Witcher 3, and that's a high level indie game. Mass Effect Andromeda, 5-year development time span, $40 million budget, AAA title. A lot of other games out there are going, like AAA games, are going 50 million or less, that sort of thing, because a lot of your AAA publishers are spending a lot less on games nowadays. Most people won't realize that, but they're trying to avoid the budget sinks of Grand Theft Auto 5 or SOTOR. They don't want to spend 100, 150, 200 million dollars on a game. They want to spend, 50 million and make, 500 million off of it. That's the idea. They want to get its big profit on there. That's another topic. Point is that the fact that Star Citizen has squandered for 5 years, right? Like they've hit their 5th year anniversary back in October. They have not yet got past the alpha stage of development. They have $150 million plus. I think might be close to $160 million at this point in crowdfunding, and they have not yet even got past the alpha stage. Tells me that they have a horrible project management problem. That tells me that they are long past any development stages, and I believe they have passed like their actual original launch goal by years. Here is the way that things should have been done. The Kickstarter, say their Kickstarter was for $10 million or what have you, and they're like, man, okay, the Kickstarter includes the persistent universe, or say the Kickstarter includes Arena Commander, right? Say it was Arena Commander because that was the first module released, right? That's the kind of base flight simulator, right? So say Arena Commander was your original module. That was what your Kickstarter funded. They should have focused and finished Arena Commander. Period. That should have been finished. Say their budgeting allowed them to finish it by 2015. Right? By the end of 2015, October in here, they should have been able to conceivably finish it by then. You notice on here, they've only gotten to Alpha 1.3, the third minor revision of the Alpha, by the 2-year marker by the 3-year marker. They have not even gotten the original concept out of here. And this was not even counting the additional modules that aren't even actually noted in here, which is kind of weird. That's kind of strange. I'm not sure why it doesn't have them. There's other modules that have been added in here since. The major point is that by then they should have had Arena Commander finished by October of 2015. Then they should have gone back and, like, say, Squadron 42. If they want to have planet landings, say that will be added in the what would you call it? Come up with a fancy name for planetary landings and colonizations. You can call it the Colony Commander module, right? Squadron 42, your first-person shooter. Mix that with your planetary or your Colony Commander as additional modules, and the other ones that they've added in since. Those would be additional things that they would then release after the base game was released, right? If they couldn't secure funding with sales, they should have gone back and said, hey, we want more crowdfunding, or add in microtransactions. All these ships concept sales, those could have been in the base game for sale in the base game that was released fully, went through the full development cycle, and you would have heard no complaints out of me. That's fine, cool, do it. The fact that these are all crowdfunding sales on here, that's the problem I have, is the fact that they're still just juicing crowdfunding. They still, to this day, have open crowdfunding. So they're literally getting sales off of a game that isn't even in the beta stages yet. And that's kind of a large problem I have on what you should have done versus what's been done. You should have focused, nailed down the scope of the game you wanted to release, finish that one. Okay, during that process, you're coming up with these additional modules that you want to add to the game. Cool, that's great. That shows some creativity, that shows passion. That's what you should have in the games industry. However, stick to your scope, finish the base game, then go back after the base game is released and add those additional modules. Continue developing a long time. If you look at a better example of how to handle project management, look at Warframe. Warframe released the game. Now they call themselves in a perpetual beta because, as I believe Steve Sinclair, the creative director on the game, he kind of says it's never going to be finished. It's kind of his passion, his it's a labor of love, as he likes to frequently cite. Essentially what they did was, back in I think 2012, they released the original beta for the game, which was pretty sparse. I mean, you had 6 Warframes, and there was just not a lot to it. I mean, you had some basic planets to go through, but they were largely all the same. You had a couple of different maps. Yes, they were procedurally generated, but there wasn't a lot of variation to those, so it kind of felt a little bit bland. However, after that, what you saw is that they continued to then add in a new thing. Finish this next thing, add this new thing. Finish this next thing, add the next thing. And they continue just adding in one block at a time, new things. And now you look at it in its current state, the game is actually, for the faults I criticize it for, it is still an amazing game. From where I've seen it come from today, how they have just steadily released content, and they have a very smart system behind it. They will have a major project that's in the works that might take several months, up to maybe a year to even finish. And during that time, they're releasing new little guns, new little Warframes, maybe Prime Access for a special Prime Warframe during that period. And all of those things, those little content drops, those new Warframes, those new weapons, the new Prime Warframe that gets released every 3 months, those are all generating perpetual revenue for the game to help them continue to develop those large projects, right? That's what Star Citizen should have done. Release the base game, right? Back in 2012, when Warframe released, right? say that took them several years to develop. That's what they should have, Star Citizen should have done back here. They should release that base game. Yeah, it might have been rough, might have been a little sparse on content, but then you're like, okay, base game's done. Now we move to this stage. Okay. Maybe the current UI that we're using doesn't really suffice anymore. Whatever, let's overhaul that. Let's set that as a major project. Warframe has gone through, I think, 3 major UI overhauls that I'm aware of. Like one of them was the star chart originally when you first had the game was really sparse and kind of was like really weird looking, and it didn't really feel like, it wasn't very immersive at all. It was kind of very generic and very simplistic, right? And then they eventually kind of refined that, made it a little bit more colorful, made it a little bit more, I would say, artistic looking, but it still really wasn't immersive. It wasn't until they released the actual Lisette on ship, which was the 3rd UI revision, that to me it really felt like it was coming into its own. And then they released, even from that point, they released yet another star chart update since then that was within the Lisette. And now they have an open world segment that is even kind of changing how you navigate through missions, even as we speak. So they have taken what they have, and they're never satisfied with where they're at. They keep improving and reshaping and overhauling things. However, they finish one project first, then they move on to a next project. And all through that time, they're making little content drops here and there to keep people playing the game. That is how you handle a video game project that's ongoing. Star Citizen has not done that. They haven't even gotten the base game out yet, even in the beta, and they're just continuing to drop content for crowdfunding. I can't say how this is any clearer to anybody. By the way, if you have not funded into Star Citizen, don't. They don't need any more money. They need to just buckle down and finish their game. Unfortunately, they're going to continue to release these concept sales. As you notice on here, the last concept sale was in August, and they're probably going to continue to do concept sales because that continues to generate revenue for the game that has not even been released yet. So, I don't know. Anyway, that's kind of my thoughts on here. So, in any case, as I always say on here, these are, while this is kind of industry standards I'm talking about, and these are established, this is still a conversation. This is not just me ranting at the screen and that sort of thing. So if you have thoughts about software development, and do you think that these steps work? Do you think that there's something that could be refined to make them better? Do you think Star Citizen is handling their stuff correctly, whereas I don't? Why don't you let me know? If you're watching this on Twitch after the fact, if you're watching as a pod, you can still drop a comment on the video and let me know there. Or if you're watching this on YouTube after the fact, feel free to let me know there as well. Obviously, I stream these lives on here, and I've kind of got a stream schedule where I'm going to be live streaming these, or at least live streaming in general, Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 7 p.m. Pacific time. I'm going to be alternating Wednesday, my next stream on here. I will be streaming a game, so there will be actually game streaming for once rather than these Mortiel fallacies, but I will continue to do these as well. Likely what I'm going to probably be doing is I'm going to be doing 2 game streams per week and then 1 Mortiel fallacy, but we'll get that situated as it comes. That also depends on how much news and how much things to talk about there are. Obviously, this was a bit more of an in-depth discussion, which is why this ran longer than the last 2 Mortiel fallacies, but it is what it is. It depends on how in-depth the discussion is, and this one was pretty technical, pretty in-depth. I know a lot of people are going to be like, whoa, that's so much stuff. But by watching this, you understand a little bit more of what goes on behind the scenes at your favorite developer and what work they actually have to do to make the games that you love. So in any case, obviously, if you guys are watching this on YouTube after the fact, there will be links to all the stuff down below on here. There will be links to the Discord server where you can come and chat with any of us Pixel Crashers, links to my Twitter where you can follow and get updates on all the good stuff on here, and also links to my Twitch channel so you can watch this live and actually join in the chat if you'd like. Anyway, I'm going to get signed off here for the night here. We're going to find someone to host here really quick, so that way we can kind of pass the torch along here. So let me take a look and see who is streaming, because I actually haven't looked in a while. Oh, good fun. So let's go ahead and throw a host over to Size 16. Size 16 is primarily a BioWare streamer, but he does occasionally do other stuff, like he tends to stream a lot of XCOM 2 and that sort of thing as well. So we're going to throw a host over to him, and that way everybody can kind of go and say hi to him and see what he's going on. He's playing Dragon Age Origins currently, which is good fun. It's a good classic game. But so in any case, we're going to get signed off here for the night. I'll be back in a couple of days on Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Pacific if you guys want to tune in. And we'll see you then. And like I said, on Wednesday, we'll be actually streaming a game. So guys, have a good night. We'll see you next time.